In 1949, a little-known University of Wisconsin professor named Aldo Leopold published what would come to be considered a classic, a masterpiece in the literature on environmentalism, called A Sand County Almanac. It contained a section that was titled Thinking Like a Mountain, which opened with those haunting words describing the howling of wolves on a mountainside that Margaret read for us earlier. In Thinking Like a Mountain, Leopold wrote about a shift in perspective he had experienced when, as a young man, he and a friend came upon an old wolf and her pack of full-grown pups while hunting deer. They opened fire on the wolves, striking down the old wolf while the rest of the pack escaped, one with an injured leg. Here are Leopold's own words describing this shift in perspective. We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. He then goes on to describe how he witnessed mountainside after mountainside where hunters had killed off the wolves thinking it would make for better deer hunting, or ranchers had killed off the wolves thinking to protect their herds, or both. Instead, without the wolves, the deer and the cattle overpopulated, destroying the foliage of the mountainside, wreaking havoc with the ecosystem and causing much of the deer and cattle population to die from starvation. The wolves, though predators, had been a vital part of the ecosystem. In Leopold's metaphor, the mountains knew this. They were tall enough to have this broader view and old enough to take a longer view. This was the change in his perspective. He had gotten a glimpse of thinking like a mountain. And this stepping back to try to get that broader, longer-term view of our actions and their potential consequences is certainly vital to our struggle to prevent the most devastating consequences to our environment from global climate change and other risks from human activities. It is a crying shame, then, that our president and his top advisors seem to be thinking more like a molehill when it comes to environmental policy. Their short-sightedness and greed for immediate gain are imperiling our future and that of generations to come, and it is but one area in which we must resist. But this trying, at least from time to time, to take that broader, longer-term view, to think like a mountain, I think is important not just in how we approach the environment, but is also an essential element of our overall personal, public, and spiritual and religious lives. In our personal lives, such a perspective shift can so often change the very course of our lives for the better. The examples are so many. The person with a substance addiction who finally sees its broader impact on their own life and the lives of those that they love, and they seek help. The sudden realization that a career choice has become misery-making and a subsequent investigation of possibilities that leads to a more life-fulfilling choice. An experience of interconnectedness in nature through meditation, religion, or other sources that leads to a shift in values away from those centered around the self and individualism and towards those more centered on relationship and connectedness with other people and our world. Now, I've certainly experienced these perspective shifts in my own life. One was when my grandmother was dying far too slowly from congestive heart failure. My mom had brought her home from the hospital and was taking care of her at my mom's house. My grandmother had been in and out of the hospital several times, and she had told us she just did not want to go back into the hospital again. Still, My grandmother seemed unhappy and maybe even miserable. She was often confused, and she would wake up in the middle of the night and walk around sometimes weakly and in danger of falling, many times not fully clothed. My mom was on the verge of emotional and physical collapse from all of this. I was calling my mom often, and one day when she picked up the phone, I realized that she was crying. She said she was exhausted and had been in bed most of the day except to get up a few times to check on my grandmother. But as we continued that conversation, we began to see a larger perspective. We helped each other broaden our vision. We began to realize that we had been valuing length of life over quality of life. We saw that being in a place that wasn't her own, lacking in the familiar, was part of the confusion and unhappiness my grandmother had been experiencing. We reached this broader understanding that this was not what my grandmother had wanted. We stopped all but palliative treatment, brought in hospice to my grandmother's own house, and she lived there in dignity for the rest of her life. She was comfortable and even seemed happy in those last weeks. I visited with her several times, and though she could be weak, she was once again in those last weeks the happy, loving person she had been her whole life. I can honestly say that it was the gentlest death I've ever experienced, and I'm so glad she didn't have to spend her last days unhappy and confused. I am so glad that we didn't rob her or ourselves of those peaceful, loving final days. Now, in our metaphor, the mountain would have already known all of this, of course, but we had to climb it first to get that higher view. Life is like that sometimes, but if we can make the climb, if we can think like a mountain, it can sometimes change our lives and the lives of those that we love for the better. Now, I think this perspective is important in our public life also. Taking that time to step back and try to gain a broader, longer-term perspective is even more important than ever now as we attempt to live out our values in the public and political arena. Faced as we are with such a barrage of distortions and outright lies, or what the Trump administration calls alternative facts, it can be easy to get bogged down arguing with one individual tweet or statement. With such an onslaught of executive orders and proposed legislation, we can fall into being overwhelmed by battle after battle and lose sight of the dangerous common ideological core that all of these proposals represent. The mountain sees the falsehoods as the distractions and attempts to misdirect that they are intended to be. The mountain sees the rooms filled with men making decisions about women's health and rights. It sees the massive tax cuts for the wealthy that would be made possible by proposed legislation that would take health care away from millions and millions of people. Health care legislation that through today seems to be refusing to die. The mountain sees profit being prioritized over sustaining life on the planet. The mountain sees an administration full of white people taking aim at the rights of immigrants and people of color. It sees anti-LGBTQ bigot after anti-LGBTQ bigot in positions of power at the highest levels of our government. The mountain sees all of these things and more, and because it has this broader view, the mountain understands that we are up against an ideology of patriarchy, white supremacy, and unbridled capitalistic oligarchy, and that any of us that don't fit within that power structure are under threat if we refuse to stay in our proper place. And because of that, the mountain knows that we need each other. The mountain sees that this is what we are up against, and we have to see it too if we're to have any hope of avoiding the fulfillment of such a dangerous, unjust, morally bankrupt ideology. And then once we see this, we also have to think like a mountain about how we might successfully resist it. Fortunately, Social science researchers such as Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen have done some of this wider, longer range thinking for us by studying which social movements in the past several decades have been the most successful. The first thing they found is that nonviolent resistance is always more effective than violence. Secondly, they found that the more disparate movements have been the most successful movements. Now, what do we mean by that? I want to talk about that a little bit in the context of this church, because I know we have sometimes within the church wondered about this. Are we better off to focus on just a few social issues and target just them in order to concentrate our limited resources? Or would we be better off with our folks working on a broad range of social justice issues as long as enough folks have energy around any one of them? And what about tactics? Which tactics should we focus on? Visiting, writing, and calling governmental officials? Should we donate money to organizations and people that are already doing this work? Or should we get more involved with grassroots protests and rallies? Well, Chenoweth and Steffen's research makes very clear that we are more likely to have success the more disparate our efforts, both in terms of topics and tactics. For instance, our immigration rights activism can support our work for LGBT rights or women's rights and reproductive issues. Each of these, when necessary, can combine their efforts and thereby amplify them. Likewise, for tactics, we need both civil and political engagement and the protest in the streets. It is encouraging then that we're seeing exactly these disparate and wide-ranging efforts develop within our church and in our larger society these days. And here's something cool. Having these disparate social justice efforts can, in fact, help us to see more broadly, to think more like a mountain, and thereby become more effective at doing social justice work, as well as live richer, fuller lives. And they do so by engaging us with folks who can have a very different perspective than our own. Many of us who are progressive, but a part of the dominant culture in our society, tend to reach a stage of development regarding how we interact with other races, cultures, and ethnicities that is called minimization. In minimization, we can see and value the many similarities that exist among us as human beings, but we have a harder time seeing and perhaps even resist or minimize the very real differences that also exist among us. And this limits our perspective. It keeps us from ever being able to see past our own life experiences. Here's some examples. Those of us who are white can't know the life experiences of people of color living within a white-dominated culture. Wow. That was the electronic God going, yeah, you're right. Those of us who are male can't know the life experiences of women living within a still patriarchal system. Straight folks can't know the experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer people in a heteronormative society. Folks assigned a gender at birth that is congruent with how they see themselves can't know the life experience of transgender folks in a system that vastly favors gender conformity, which, by the way, supports the patriarchy and serves as at least part of the support structure holding up racism and these other forms of oppression. Here's what's important, though. Despite these and other differences, we can learn to value the perspective these experiences bring if we're willing to listen and to do the work. And we start by interacting with and valuing equal the people and their perspectives whose life experiences are different than our own. We start by refusing to give our own cultural perspective supremacy over another. By learning to value difference, we can widen our own worldview and thereby become more effective at dismantling these very systems of racism and oppression that I've been talking about, and by doing so, we will enrich our own lives and the lives of those with whom we interact. I want to close by talking a little bit about how all of this has a spiritual and religious dimension, this thinking like a mountain, has a religious and spiritual dimension. Sometimes when we have that time of centering and breathing together here at the church or at other points in the worship service, sometimes when I'm out with a group of church folks doing social justice activities, I will close my eyes and I'll get this deep sense of interconnectedness with this religious community that I serve and that I love. And somehow through that, a sense of interconnectedness with that sacred web of all existence of which we are a part. Now, in religious and spiritual context, these experiences have been called things like experiences of the holy, or the transcendent, or of God and the divine. Some Buddhists and Hindus might call them nirvana, although they would have different meanings for that term. Humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow had a similar concept he called peak experiences, and other psychologists talk about flow experiences. Extreme sports enthusiasts will tell you that such altered mental states can also be brought on by participating in extreme sports. Neurologists, psychologists, and others have begun studying these altered states of consciousness more and more, and they're discovering what's going on in our brains and with us physiological when we have such experiences. They are also discovering that these experiences are causing us to actually think in a different way. We are making connections we don't ordinarily understand. We're experiencing transformations within our deepest core values. We are grasping our universe and our place within it in ways that are much broader than our normal day-to-day understandings. Because of all this, organizations ranging from Google to the Navy SEALs are studying ways to help people have such experiences more easily and more often, because these experiences are also associated with this wider, longer-term form of mental processing that seems to enhance creativity, increase productivity, and strengthen team cohesion. Well, if you're a Navy SEAL, team cohesion is pretty darn important. It seems that our deepest spiritual experiences, however we may label them, are helping us to get that more timeless perspective and from a much higher elevation, so to speak. Perhaps this is the great purpose of church and religious community. Together, we help one another cultivate and move into these types of experiences. Together, we climb the mountain, and our view, our perspective expands, and from that mountaintop, we glimpse the ancient truths the mountains have learned. We get a glimmer of the vistas the mountains look out upon. And knowing something of what the mountain knows, together, we are then better able to go out and change our own lives and our world for the better. This is our great purpose together. We gather in community. We go up to the mountaintop together so that together we are better able to nourish souls, transform lives, and do justice. And amen to that.